Welcome to Environmentally Speaking, brought to you by the Richmond-Wayne County Environmental Council. I'm your host, Stephanie Hays-Mussoni. Did you know that the human body is made up of over 70% water? Our body needs water every day to stay a functioning being. You can actually go longer without food than you can go without water and still survive. So water's pretty essential to our survival, and it's really important to make sure that we have clean, good quality drinking water. Today we're here at the Middlefork Reservoir, and I'm with Kelly Dungan, the project manager for Friends of the Middlefork. They are a group that does a lot to make sure that our water quality is of high quality before it goes through our drinking water plant. And she's here today to tell us a little bit about watersheds, what a watershed is, how we impact our watershed, and what we can do as citizens in our community to improve and make sure that our water quality stays of a high quality. We all live downstream, we all live upstream, and it's important to realize that. And Kelly's going to tell us just a little bit about what that means. Thank you for being with us today, Kelly.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me what Friends of the Middlefork is first. What is that group and what do they do and how were they formed?
The committee actually formed in the mid-90s with the water company, their water specialist, Rich Nicholson, and other concerned community members. They came together and decided they needed to protect the reservoir, which provides over half of Richmond's drinking water. So it's a very vital area for the city. So they developed a committee. They came together and they ended up applying for some grants. They received a Lake and River Enhancement Grant through the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. With that, they hired a part-time technician, watershed technician. He worked with landowners and farmers, and they had some cost share money to help farmers and landowners do things that would help improve the water quality.
Okay.
The committee, they continued during that time, and they applied for a grant through the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. IDEM receives so much money each year through the Clean Water Act, EPA Clean Water Act, and they use that money to help keep water clean. So they applied and received a grant, and that began my position in 2002. So 5 years later, we're still active and doing our part to help protect the reservoir.
So your big component has been the Middle Fork of the East Fork of the Whitewater River, correct?
That's correct.
And so that is what directly impacts the Middlefork Reservoir and essentially our drinking water here in Richmond. And so tell me, and if you can show us on the map what that is. I mean, everyone kind of knows where the reservoir is, and so if we can kind of point the reservoir out on the map and where that watershed is, and using the map, kind of explain what a watershed is, because that's important.
Yeah, we hear the term watershed, and it's a simple concept, but it's a little hard to grasp. What it is, no matter where you are on land, when rain hits, when rain falls, it's going to drain somewhere. And it's going to end up in a lake or a river or a stream. It's going to end up in a water body eventually. It's either going to run off the surface or percolate down into the groundwater and end up flowing. So this is a map of the Middlefork watershed, and down here, this is the reservoir.
So the reservoir is that tiny gray thing on the map down there, and the rest is the watershed that drains directly in, or drains eventually into this reservoir.
Right. So when we
it's a much bigger area.
See a body of water, it's not just the land directly, around it that we may think of as being impacting it, but it's all this land area up here, up into Randolph County, a small portion in Randolph County. And about half the watershed is actually across the state line in Ohio. Watersheds never follow political lines, state lines.
They didn't read the map.
It's a really it's an interesting concept because we're so used to looking at county limits and city limits, and this goes beyond that. But so all this land area here drains down and eventually will end up into the reservoir. So this is the land we've been dealing with.
So anything that hits the soil in any area of this land will eventually end up in one form into the reservoir. Some of it may have been cleaned out during through natural process of soil, but the majority of things is they're going to find their way into this reservoir. What are some of those items that might find their way to the reservoir, and from what sources would those be? originating?
Because this watershed is about 90% agriculture, we see the agricultural impacts.
Okay.
Not to say that we don't have residential use and things going on that are also impacting it, but we see things like E. coli, which is the bacteria coming from warm-blooded animals.
From their fecal matter, right?
You know,
okay.
we do have some livestock, and we know that there are some impacts from livestock. There could also be failed septic systems.
Oh, okay.
Like that. We see nutrient levels, phosphorus, nitrates. Sometimes we see spikes in those. A lot of times that would be from land application.
Land application of fertilizer,
Yes.
which is usually manure, correct?
It can be manure, but it can also just be the nitrogen.
Chemical fertilizers.
Chemicals.
And how does nitrogen and phosphorus, how's that impact our water?
Well, what we see is when we have this large amount of nutrient, we can see that we'll get algal blooms.
Okay.
And the algal blooms a lot of times will, impact the other qualities, the oxygen, things like that. So we never want to see a huge amount of nutrients in the water.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about those parameters later on when we talk about the water quality testing that your group does. So the watershed, and now the part that doesn't fall into our watershed is somebody else's watershed.
That's right. No matter where you are, the streams will end up flowing
into a water source.
Into a water source.
And so when you say everyone lives downstream or someone lives upstream, the folks that live upstream of us, upstream of the reservoir, are impacting essentially what we're going to have drinking water-wise. And now our water is purified through a drinking water plant, but there are certain elements that are not able to be purified out of our drinking water. Are there any that kind of resonate with you that might be concerned in a watershed?
One of the things that we've done, the water company tests for atrazine, which is an herbicide that's heavily applied on farm ground because it's effective and it's cheap. So it's used a lot. Through our cost share program, we've actually offered incentives to farmers to use a reduced atrazine chemical program. And with that, we offer cost share on their chemicals if they sign up for the program and promise to continue that for the next 4 years.
So you share the price of the chemicals then with them,
That's
and
right.
they're promising to use a lesser amount
Right.
that will be utilized instead of necessarily all making its way into
and the
through
reason
runoff.
that's a concern is we don't want those chemicals in our drinking water, and of course they are cleaned out. But it costs the water company, more money.
Sure.
And a lot of times people complain about maybe the chlorine taste in the water. Well, the more things that are entering into the reservoir, the more cleaning process, the more cost, and you're going to get that bad taste and odor.
So that's going to impact your water quality as far as taste, as far as what chemicals may or may not be in it, and how that affects your body, as well as the cost and the cost to the company, and then those costs will eventually be transferred to the customer. So it's in everyone's interest to make sure we're doing things to improve our water quality.
And IDEM they have a water body impairment list, and the reservoir has been on that list for taste, odor, and algae problems for the past probably 7 years or so. So yeah, that's a concern for the people who live in Richmond because they have to deal with that as their drinking water.
And so basically, and when you're talking about these chemicals and how they get into our water, they get in via what means? How do they get into our water quality? Is it runoff through the soil or directly, or?
Sure, we definitely see runoff, especially from bare fields, that don't have any vegetation on them. We're seeing sediment, and when that enters in, everything that's in the soil is coming into the water with it. And we see on the northern end of the reservoir, it's starting to fill in. Fishermen, have told me that, what's going on the northern end? Well, basically, because of some of the practices going on in the watershed, that sediment, that soil is coming down and it's ending up in the reservoir. And in the future, there may be some issues with the reservoir, being dredged.
Is it still true that the number one water pollution source is sediment?
Sediment is a huge issue. E. coli is also a major issue from the warm-blooded animals, the fecal material. The watershed has been listed on that water body impairment for E. coli as There's about 45 different watersheds that have been on that list.
Oh, wow,
Been added
okay.
on that list in Wayne County.
In Wayne County,
Yes.
okay. So what are some things that, you mentioned your cost share programming, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that you're gathering your data, but what are some other ways that you do to educate the public about our watershed and how they can positively impact our watershed by their actions?
We have had a number of public events. We talk about forestry issues. We talk about septic issues and maintenance with the health department. We had one just this past summer. We do reservoir cleanups in conjunction with the parks department twice annually. So we're doing a number of things to try to get the word out. We put out Middlefork memos, our quarterly newsletter, and things like that.
So what are some direct actions you hear all the time about? We hear these kind of smaller things that the local homeowner can do to make a difference, and they really do make a difference. What are some of those things that are practices that your average homeowner can implement at their home, whether changing a behavior or changing something they're doing or implementing something at their home?
Yeah, and there are a lot of things, homeowners can do. Be careful with their fertilizer applications on their lawns. Have their septic system checked. If it's been more than 5 years, you really need to have it inspected and make sure you're not having any problems with that. If you live along a stream, check to see, how are your stream banks looking. If you have a lot of stream bank erosion, there's simple things you can do, like planting willow trees and things to create root systems to hold the stream bank in. So there are simple things, and just being involved and being neighborly. And if you see something going on, down the road or along a bridge, let us know.
And we'll have your number on the screen as well for folks that can contact you directly if they need to report something or say, hey, I have this question or an issue. As well. Now you've started this project of the Middle Fork of the East Fork of the Whitewater River, and it's a pretty large area. Now you've just received the funding to focus on another area. Well, you'll continue focusing on this area, but this area is much larger, and I want to show the map in comparison before we talk about your volunteer needs.
Yeah, it's a very exciting project. And it is a much larger land area. It's actually the Nolans Fork on west in the county.
And the one that you finished, show us that one first that we just spoke about on that map.
This is just this area right here.
So, and the reservoir's like right there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right down there.
So that tiny little areas that on this map is what they've worked on.
We focused on 2 years to create the management plan, and then we've had about another 2.5 years doing the cost share projects and continuing education. This next project is actually a 3-year project just to create the management
plan.
It's such a large area. It includes the Nolans Fork, the Greens Fork, the Martindale, and what's called the West Fork itself.
Wow.
But it's the entire West Fork watershed.
Wow.
And the reason, if you can see the red lines on these maps, these are all considered impaired watersheds in the county. Each of these different colors represents a small sub-watershed.
And you'll be focusing on all of those.
That's correct.
Wow, that is a big project for one project coordinator.
It is.
So I anticipate you need some help, or you have some help along the way to coordinate this plan and develop this plan. Can you tell us a little bit about who is helping you currently, and maybe if there's any partnerships, and then also what kind of help you're going to need in the future when you're beginning work on this plan?
Right. Well, I'm lucky to have a wonderful person that helps me with the water quality aspects, Dick Roeper, and you'll be talking with him later. And he has offered his services to help us, and we've already started gathering some water quality data on the West Fork. Once the project gets kicked off, we'll be forming steering committees.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to hope to reach people living in those
areas.
Because our steering committee now is mostly people from Richmond and living in the Middle Fork watershed. So we're going to be creating new steering committees. We're going to have a major water monitoring subcommittee, I hope, that will help us gather a massive amount of data to try to figure out what's going on the West Fork and what we can do to help clean it up. Right.
It's surprising to me, we take advantage that we can go to the faucet and get clean water out of it, but the amount of processes that go into making sure we have that clean water, and then all the impacts in the process that the water takes, the journey, the incredible journey, so to speak, that it takes before it gets to our faucet. And we take advantage of that so much. And it really is up to us as citizens and as folks that live upstream and downstream to get involved and help with these issues and do our part to make sure that we have clean water for now and for future generations. So with that, we're going to talk to your lead volunteer and water expert, Dick Roeper, and talk a little bit about some of those water quality issues and things that you're testing and doing now, and some physical ways that volunteers can get involved. But working on these committees and offering their services, I'm sure you need office support all the time. So even though you may not be directly out there in the water testing, there are ways to help these projects and help to support what's going on for clean water here in our area. So thank you very much, Kelly. We'll move over and talk to Dick. Volunteers are an integral component for what the Friends of the Middle Fork carries out through their various studies. Here today with us is Dick Roeper. He is Professor Emeritus at which college, Dick?
Alma College in Michigan.
Alma College in Michigan. He continues to teach classes in biology at IU East today. He's the Vice President of the Friends of the Middle Fork Board, involved in anything water quality related here in Wayne County, I would venture to say.
Seems that way.
It is. Dick's our go-to person with that. He's the lead volunteer and really is the water quality expert for the whole organization here. And so what he's going to do today is show us a little bit about what volunteers can do to help this project. They have to collect a lot of data throughout the year for various areas along the different watersheds, along the watershed. And he's going to show us some of those tests and how easy they are to do and why they're important and what exactly you're going to be testing. And so I'm just going to turn it over to you and tell us a little bit about the volunteers, what they would be doing and what you do.
Sure. Well, initially in the project, we had to develop what was called a water management plan, which meant that the group needed to find out exactly where there were water quality problems.
So kind of a baseline.
Yeah, we needed, because there wasn't really any data on the watershed at all. And so that's what we really did the first few years, was really get that baseline data. And what we're doing then is kind of follow-up monitoring of what we've been doing. We used some IUE students, 4 students were involved with individual research projects with me on the watershed, mostly during the early spring and summer periods when we do most of our testing. And we did a variety of tests. We're only going to show you a few tests today. We generally go out with sample mainly off of various established sites. We have mostly bridges, which gave us access, but in some cases we went up some individual tributaries and studied those as well. Basically, we'd monitor about 10 to 12 environmental qualities, water quality problems. Some of the important ones which we're not going to be able to show you today, are testing for E. coli, which is basically, of course, fecal pollution from warm-blooded animals. We also do some testing on BOD, which is basically the amount of organic material in the water. It's called oxygen biological demand studies. The instrument testing that we're going to show you now is basically doing some dissolved oxygen testing, which we do pH, conductivity, as well as total dissolved solids. Other FASTs we do are, of course, 2 key nutrients are basically nitrogen and phosphorus. And from these kinds of studies, we get some basics of really kind of what's going on, where are the sources of potential contamination to the watershed, and basically, in other words, what gets down here to the reservoir to save. So let me briefly show you what we do. This is not really rocket science here. We just go out and we get a sample of water, and usually Kelly gets this because she's stronger than I am. and we use various kinds of automated probes. This is an oxygen probe here, and it gives us temperature. We simply immerse it in the container, and we measure basically what the temperature of the water is, as well as what the oxygen. It has to stabilize for a while, and so it takes a while to adjust.
Now, why is oxygen important in water?
Well, mainly because the aquatic organisms need the oxygen. They cannot, although there are some air-breathing organisms that are in the water, most of them are using the ambient oxygen that's in the water. So basically, what we see as far as resident organisms are concerned are largely decided on oxygen. In other words, if there is low oxygen tolerance, we find very kind of pollution-tolerant type organisms like bloodworms that have neat mechanisms of getting up low concentrations of oxygen. Those that don't have those means are what we call intolerant organisms. And those we really are really really looking for, because they really tell us where our clean water is versus our contaminated water.
And so this dissolved oxygen reading that you'll receive from this meter will say, kind of give you an indicator of the quality of the water, kind of a
Yeah, and
overview.
then that forms the basis of the BOD test, because we take a sample back, put it in the dark for 5 days in a colored bottle, and we then remeasure it, and we see the decrease is caused by respiration, so we kind of see the amount of organic material in the water.
So how many critters are eating the oxygen in there, basically?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Big deal.
The other probe we have here is another probe we use as will give us our pH and our and basically conductivity and as well as total dissolved solids.
Oh, okay. So all that comes from one probe, one reading right there. That's amazing.
There are even more sophisticated type probes that give you do it all in one thing.
That's amazing.
We have several other kits that we use with other kinds of probes. We're basically looking at the as I said, phosphorus and nitrogen, and those are important to us because, I mean, kind of what's really happening in the reservoir at this time, I was talking to Rich Nicholson the other day, is that they're having a good bloom of blue-green algae in the thing. And this is mainly dependent, of course, on what we call nutrient loading coming down from the watershed into the reservoir. And that is not, in a sense, a health problem, but it's a taste problem.
Oh, okay.
And so the water company has to clean all that up, and it costs money, and blah, 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 blah. So, and as Kelly will talk about, and has talked about, the projects are mainly trying to attempt to try to reduce nutrient flow, and of course, mainly nitrogen, phosphorus, because this will really affect the environment here.
And when you're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus that this algae can essentially eat, correct? And that's why it's able to bloom and have a big proliferation.
Those are two kind of key minerals that are in water, which are generally limiting to growth of organisms.
So where does that come from?
Well, it comes from general runoff, obviously, off the landscape, uncovered land, and obviously misuse of fertilizer, overuse of fertilizer, and part of what we've been trying to do is have the farmers reduce the amount of fertilizer they use, as well as trying to produce buffers between their fields and the actual ambient water, which is coming down in this area. Okay,
so kind of protecting the water before it gets into the flowing water that then eventually gets here to be our drinking water. So with pH is always a really hard thing to explain to people. And I just say it's either acidic or basic, and either end of the spectrum is bad.
Well, yeah, it's mostly basic here because actually a lot of the water of the Middle Fork runs across bedrock.
Okay.
And so we got a lot of buffering from the high calcium concentration. It is not very variable, and we don't really see much variation in that. It's not one of the major parameters we have seen as a major factor.
And what is a good pH reading?
Around here, anywhere from about 7.5 over to just about 8.
And 7 is neutral, where it's not acidic, it's not basic. But it's going to be
alkaline here because of the bedrock.
Because of the bedrock. So we have pretty decent, good. But that is one indicator. Say you had a pH of 4 or 5 or 2.
Yes, but we wouldn't see that here as much. We do see some, if you do have some ammonia input into the water, it'll all of the pH bring it down a little bit. That's mainly caused by, again, animal decomposition of fecal material again, and we have seen that in cases we have.
And that would throw up a red flag.
Yeah, our main red flags we're seeing, but we're mainly going with state standards are using E. coli testing.
Okay.
Because that's what they've kind of used as a standard to indicate what river is in good shape, what rivers are in impaired shape, and that's why this grant was issued in the first place, was that this was an impaired river. Not only for that reason, but there were some heavy metal problems too at that time, which seem to be working out. Don't seem to have those as much.
And there's a great website too, before we get to the readings, that tells you all of the different bodies of water in Indiana and what their impaired level is. Well, and I don't remember, we can flash it later on the screen.
Yeah, there are some sites like that. And then of course there is what we call River Watch, which is run out of the DNR, which is a kind of a community volunteer grouping, which have sponsored workshops. They've had several workshops, even in Richmond. They'll come every year and teach people how to do these tests and how to do this kind of monitoring.
And so when you train your volunteers to go out and do water quality monitoring, they are usually going out to a couple different spots over and over and over again several times during the year, and they're running various tests.
Yeah, we try to keep static to probably about 6 to 8 sites along the river, which we've monitored now for 5 years.
Oh, okay.
And we just ran the data on that the other day, and we had done over almost 90 tests, about
amazing.
400 different sites during this 5-year period. So we try to keep consistent with it and try to keep an eye on it. But then we've been also focused at looking at some tributaries, some problems we knew we had, some sites that we knew were perhaps contamination was coming from, and trying to identify those and then work with the people that own the property that those are around.
So, and with, you have a decent size of volunteers right now, but with the new project being so much larger, you really have a need for more quality volunteers who are willing to go through the training and be committed to this project.
This kind of probing here is not really that intensive. Kelly and I have done a lot of it ourselves, but when we get to doing, we like to do what we call biological monitoring too. What we use mainly there is macroinvertebrates, because they sit in the stream. They're the kind of the residents of the stream. And although this value here for conductivity could change tomorrow because something coming down the stream, they sit there all the time reading the environment. They kind of give us the best indication of what's going on in the stream. So biological monitoring, which is very labor intensive, which means that we have to go down in the stream, collect the organisms, bring them back out, sort them, and then
identify them and then count them.
Well, the identification, we don't really have to go that detailed identification. We just mainly work to insect orders, and we can tell from some organisms that are, in a sense, what we said, a pollution intolerant, that the water quality is good, and we can score that to ones that are not.
Which to me, that part of it is so fascinating, because you find different populations all throughout, and it's amazing to see all the different critters.
We tried to sample kind of a very similar habitat in each case, which is a riffle community, which we have, we can go up and down the stream at, and it offers some basis of comparison. When we have to go into a slower moving stream, you're going to get a different community type just because of the habitat.
So you're very cautious of comparing apples to apples,
right?
In a sense, yes.
Right.
And those biological monitoring studies are a lot of fun, because you do get into the stream. It's almost, children I know love these kind of things, because you're essentially looking under rocks and kind of digging for critters in a way.
Right.
But it's got a much more scientific value in this case. So.
We try to do a kind of a more systematic thing, and it'll be interesting. We need to get back into the Middlefork. We did a lot of early testing on that, and I had our parameters pretty well established. We need to kind of back and try to do a follow-up study, see how if we've improved it at all. Whether we've improved it or not is a good question. But these indicator communities, along with fish being present, are kind of really what people can understand as being where pollution exists. And whether it exists today or whether it existed last night, the organisms living there are going to read the environment.
Sure.
They're the important ones.
Great. Well, that's very exciting to know that there's volunteer opportunities, and everybody needs to give back to their community, and this is a great way to do that. And Kelly will get you all set. And the training's wonderful. It's a lot of fun to go through River Watch and to learn about these probes, and you really learn a lot about your water and the critters that live in it, and it's
I don't
amazing.
think it's necessary to go through the workshop, although it's really nice if you do. We can train you certainly, and we could take kids all the way down, I think, and certainly into the junior high school level, even probably in the higher grades. They work pretty well. Little kids, probably.
They're rough. They want to play under the rocks and kick the mud up. But that's important, because later on they'll be our water quality volunteers.
Right.
That's right.
But we can deal with the students pretty well down there.
That's good to know.
Good.
Good. Do we have any readings today, or
well,
what do we have?
Just kind of looking here to see what we have. The water temperature today is 23, which is expected, and this is our
23 degrees Celsius, yes.
This is 213 for total dissolved solids. And the pH is 8.14. And conductivity is 424.
What's conductivity?
Conductivity has to do with the amount of ions that are in the water. And it's basically reading the electrical potential in the water. So in other words, it's really the amount of dissolved ions that are in the water, whether they be calcium ions or potassium ions or whatever they are. So it gives you kind of a general indication of how much has been dissolved in the water.
Okay.
These readings are nominal, and they're much within range.
Okay. Okay, good deal.
Our pH read.
So our pH was about 8.14. That's one that people will recognize, and that's within parameters, so it's decent.
Yep.
And so what about our dissolved oxygen?
Well, let's see, my probe is ran out of batteries today, so we have to check. I generally check it every day, but we did check it this morning. So it's not giving a good reading.
Not a good reading. What is a good dissolved oxygen reading?
Well, generally anything below 4 parts per million becomes limiting. So we generally are looking for readings between 4 and 10. In some situations, we actually get a super saturated oxygen situation in some of our streams. But that does tell us something too. That means that there is more enrichment going on, and there's a lot of algae in the water, and there's a lot of photosynthesis going on in the water.
Giving off oxygen.
Which gives you a super saturation. So sometimes you say, well, you got a lot of oxygen, it's great, but really it's indication that something else is going on.
So those extremes on pH and dissolved oxygen are indicators that there's a problem.
Always.
Yeah,
Always
extremes.
Looking for the extremes.
You always want to be middle of the road. It's a good
Right,
place to be, right?
Right.
Good deal. Well, and we'll put the number on the screen too where people can call to volunteer and get involved with water
call
quality.
Kelly.
Here in Richmond and Wayne County, there's a lot of big things going on.
Yep.
Also, there's always a lot of different projects and opportunities to get involved and make sure that your drinking water is as clean as it possibly can be. That's all we have time for today on Environmentally Speaking. Thank you to Dick and Kelly for taking the time to teach us more about our water quality and how we really do live upstream of someone and downstream of someone as well, and our actions every day do make a difference. Have a great day.